What's up, everybody? Hope you're all fantastic. We're continuing our look back at some of the memorable sequels from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I recently did videos on both great sequels to classic 80s movies and on sequels from great 80s movies that I think completely failed. I'll leave those both linked here for you guys to check out if you're interested. But today we're stepping back into the 1970s. Cinema hadn't quite boomed at this point in time, but it was on the rise. There were a ton of memorable releases, many of which had great sequels. So in this video, I'm diving into 10 awesome sequels from great movies released during the 1970s. Back in 1976, a boxing match would go the distance when a raw, up-and-coming fighter would take on the world champ in Rocky, an award-winning critical and financial hit with a behind-the-scenes story as awesome as the in-the-ring story on the screen. 3 years later, Balboa and Creed would lock up in the rematch of the century in Rocky II, with Stallone taking over the directing duties. Rocky II didn't reach the same critical acclaim as the first, but it was well received, and there was still that intricacy and the emotional elements of the story in the hands of Stallone's direction that made the movie a solid follow-up in the underdog story of Rocky Balboa. Stallone would eventually take the series to much more superficial and flashy levels in parts 3 and 4, but 2 still holds up as one of the better films in the franchise when relying on the dramatic layering of the character arcs. It delivers all the training montages and in-ring action you'd want from a boxing flick, but to me, Rocky II was a movie that really thrived during the quiet moments between all the action, with Rocky navigating his life outside of the ring with Adrian and with Mickey and a new baby, and while Weathers was shining as well as Creed on the counter side of the plot, just hell-bent on getting his redemption with a clean win. And to me, Rocky II still holds up as one of the better films in this long-lasting franchise. Ridley Scott would deliver a sci-fi horror masterpiece with 1979's Alien. In would come director James Cameron, and 7 years later, like he would do with the Terminator franchise, he would take a dark and gritty, smaller film and use it to create a blockbuster action sequel with Aliens in 1986, a movie that, like Terminator 2, would raise the cinematic spectacle to awesome levels. Now, to me, the first two Alien and Terminator movies almost mirror one another in style. If you want a gritty, claustrophobic, sci-fi horror thriller, then Alien is a go-to. If you want that exact same atmosphere, but instead served as a big, tough, macho action adventure, then Aliens is the film to see, because Cameron took this small concept and turned it into a massive, large-scale action thriller with endless memorable moments and just a buffet of unnerving suspense and high-octane action. I love the cast in this sequel. I love the practical effects. I love the grimy production design and just the immaculate direction from Cameron. Plus, this sequel sticks the landing perfectly. I think the closing to this 2-hour-plus long spectacle ride is just delightfully satisfying, with Ripley in her exosuit just battling the xenomorph one-on-one. Many people consider this to be a better film, and while that is up for debate, I certainly think it's an incredible film that succeeds on every level as a sequel. The Man of Steel would make his big screen debut in 1978's Superman. It was extremely well received. Now, there was always intended to be a sequel for the Caped Hero, since these two movies were shot simultaneously, and after some director issues, Richard Donner, with about 75% of his sequel shot, would be fired. Richard Lester would come in, and Superman 2 would be released in 1980. Growing up, I was definitely a Superman 2 kid. I watched this movie so many times. I loved the humor as a kid, and the villainous trio of Zod, Ursa, and Non were a perfect counter to Superman. The sequel was shot with the first film. There was a highly publicized change in directors, but it doesn't hurt the finished product, in my opinion. I think both Donner and Lester's directorial visions, for the most part, blend well enough to keep the continuity in this film. As an adult, the humor does get a bit too slapstick, but overall, I still love the just comic book world that this movie captures. The pace is tighter than the original, the action is more imposing and more harrowing. It's a cliche to say, but I mean, Superman 2 just kind of feels like the pages of a comic book playing out on the big screen with just enough camp to complement the melodrama, and when the finale kicks in with Superman battling Zod in Metropolis, the results can still put a smile on my face and harken back to the kid inside of me who just loved the Man of Steel. John Carpenter's Halloween would introduce a new icon to the horror genre while also giving the genre what many people consider to be a horror masterpiece. It was natural a sequel would come. Carpenter essentially refused to direct and appointed the duties to Rick Rosenthal, and in 1981, Halloween 2 would be released, continuing the story of Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. This was another sequel growing up that I again preferred over the first. I know the first is a horror classic and its slow plotting and methodical pacing is intentional, but personally I just slightly prefer this sequel. I enjoy the tighter pacing, I like the increased body count and the action that it brings, I like the elevated slasher vibe in the hospital settings and all the confined tension that comes from the shadows of this movie. Plus, Myers just has more to do and I've always loved it. This film was naturally not as favorable with the critics, but when looking back at all the terrible Halloween sequels that would come over the years, Halloween 2 may not be as traditionally good as the first, but it is a worthy contender that I think would have held up much better over time had the series just died at the end of this film with Strode and Myers closing out their battle. But when going back to revisit the franchise each season, I always watch the first film simply to set up the enjoyable terror that this sequel delivers. To say 1977 Star Wars was a revolutionary cinematic experience would be a bit of an understatement. Years would slowly tick by, paving the way for the most anticipated sequel of all time. The pressure and the expectations for this movie were through the roof, and when The Empire Strikes Back would be released in 1980, it would end up being one of the greatest sequels of all time. Now, I love all three of the original Star Wars films, but The Empire Strikes Back was hands down my favorite as a kid. I had this movie on VHS. I would watch it almost every Saturday and Sunday morning with my cereal early in the morning before going out to play with my friends. There was really so much pressure on this sequel to succeed, and not only did it live up to the high bar set from the first, it just knocked it out of the park with bigger, more adrenaline-pumping action sequences, much higher stakes, more awesome new characters, incredible world building, and all the same old charm from the core group of characters to make for a sequel that went bigger and better in all the ways you could hope for. Now, I've always felt like the Star Wars movies were a little bit too talky, even as an adult, but what I loved about The Empire Strikes Back was that it was just much more engaging. It was a bit more higher energy with a great balance between the heroes and the villains. This sequel didn't just ride the coattails of the first. It built its own legitimacy and would end up being, in my opinion, the best sequel ever made. In 1971, Shaft would be released, starring Richard Roundtree as a private detective that men wanted to be and women wanted to be with. It was a modest hit, pulling in $13 million on a $500,000 budget, so a sequel would come 1 year later in 1972's Shaft Big Score, a follow-up that ramped up the action, elevated the energy, and totally dialed up the style. I remember growing up, I had this friend whose parents both had great jobs. They had a nice house. They had all the new release snacks that you could actually sit on the couch and eat while watching commercials for them, which was a completely new concept to me. They had that gigantic 80s and 90s entertainment system, and they were definitely movie geeks because they had quite the little VCR bootlegging racket going on. Their home collection of movies in the converted hall closet was just a treasure trove of titles from literally every genre, and in their collection was the Shaft movies, and my favorite of them all was Shaft's Big Score. The original was okay. I appreciate its slow burn crime procedural pacing much more as an adult, but as a kid, Shaft's Big Score had it all. It had cool music, big action, style, endless sex appeal that made it feel like an action movie that we shouldn't have been watching as a kid. Then front and center was Richard Roundtree as Shaft, a smooth talker that was never in over his head, and I still think this sequel is my favorite in the Roundtree Shaft era. Clint Eastwood would step into an iconic character when he would play the grizzled cop Harry Callahan in 1971's Dirty Harry. The film was a hit, so a couple of years later in 1973, Eastwood would grab his .44 Magnum revolver once again to take on vigilante cops in the follow-up sequel, Magnum Force. I never watched this movie completely through until my college years, but it was one that I remembered seeing playing on the TV as a kid. What stood out to little me at the time was the motorcycle cops being the villains and how post-direction would often frame the characters without their faces in view, which really just hit me with an eerie vibe as a kid. Watching it later, I wouldn't say I like it better than Dirty Harry, but I do appreciate the added style to Magnum Force. You get all the tough as nails, anti-authority gusto from Eastwood, but you also get elevated stunt work, more elaborate camera angles, and action sequences that hit a little harder than they did in Dirty Harry. This group of vigilante cops in action are menacing enough. They're a little thin on the writing side, but they work for a sequel that repeats what was successful from the first while really only elevating the polish. It's like the same Cadillac, but with a new great wax job that just kind of makes driving the same old car feel new again. This was one of those cases where a sequel would turn a franchise into a global success. When Mad Max was released in 1979, it would find success as a gritty independent film out of Australia, but when Mad Max 2, known to many as The Road Warrior, would be released in 1981, it would turn the character of Mad Max into an action icon for years to come. Mad Max is an iconic flick, but I think most would agree The Road Warrior is a masterclass in practical action and thrilling stunt work that just took the character to legendary, worldwide commercial levels of appeal. This sequel took a small indie film and turned it into a global franchise. It's filled with wildly eccentric characters and bold performances led by Mel Gibson, who is just a complete badass. Lord Humongous and Wes lead a delightfully sadistic crew of villains, and the pace is really dialed up to breakneck speed. But what sets this movie apart is the massive action set pieces that still look as visually exciting here in 2025 as they did back in 1981. I watched this movie so many times when I was a kid. I loved the amusement park ride of carnage that it delivers, and it's still able to kind of thrive on its foreboding intention and its ominous atmosphere. And where many sequels hope to simply succeed, The Road Warrior, with its nonstop action and suspense, was a sequel that turned the character of Mad Max into an action legend in cinema. Now, Star Trek had long been a staple for television audiences. By the time Star Trek the Motion Picture would be released in 1979, it was a critical and financial success for the most part, so there was no doubt that a sequel would come. But when Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan would be released, its popularity would quickly surpass the original and go down as the most well-known film in the franchise. Now, I've never been a huge sci-fi fantasy fan. I, of course, loved Star Wars growing up. I never really got into Star Trek, despite episodes of that playing on the TV in the backdrop is like a fabric of my childhood and teenage years. But with that said, I really did enjoy this follow-up sequel that audiences and critics seem to enjoy more than the first. The Wrath of Khan was the Star Trek movie I remember watching so many times growing up as a kid. Those creatures that went into your ear just freaked me out. I remember Ricardo Montalban's performance being imposingly menacing as a kid, and it has slowly morphed into being kind of comically menacing as an adult. And overall, I just enjoyed this adventure. I think the stakes that were on the line really give the plot a hard-hitting set of ramifications that kind of completely locked me in as a kid, really. The Wrath of Khan has all the familiar faces in place. It counters this with a world-class villain in Khan. It just makes this sci-fi adventure a complete package. The movie never turned me into a Trekkie, but it is my favorite movie in the Shatner-Nimoy film series. I think everybody would pretty much agree that Cheech and Chong are the godfathers of the buddy stoner comedy, and their rolling out film Up in Smoke from 1978 was a relative success, so the fun-loving duo would hit the screen once again in 1980 with Cheech and Chong's next movie, a sequel that may not have been as good as Up in Smoke, but one that still delivers a ton of laughs. I remember an older brother of a buddy of mine had a few of the Cheech and Chong movies on VHS. This was one of them, and as a kid, I really loved it, even though I really had no idea what I was exactly watching. I knew it was crude and edgy. It just made me laugh, even though most of the jokes went right over my head until I was in high school. I wouldn't say I prefer this sequel over Up in Smoke, but I still love the comical absurdity of the story. This movie is like a comical carnival sideshow, and I think it's a blast. The jokes are firing much quicker in this movie, and just the over-the-top silliness of it all still cracks me up as an adult. I love Cheech and Chong. I love their chemistry. I think it's so natural, as is their comedic timing. And sure, this sequel kept the same themes, but it certainly did its own thing. It's wild, it's absurd, it's raunchy and splashes, yet it's all lined with quick-witted and just a clever sense of humor that makes it dumb fun at its finest. And that's it for this video, guys. Here are my picks for 10 great sequels to some awesome movies to come out of the 70s. Now that I'm saying this, I realized I completely forgot The Godfather, but I will be doing a sequel video to this one as well. I will definitely get it in on the next round. I hope you guys have been enjoying this little trip down sequel memory lane. If you have some picks that are in your mind that I haven't mentioned, put them down in the comments. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. You guys are all fantastic. I appreciate each and every one of yours viewership. It means the world to me. Hope to see you guys all back in my next video coming real soon. And until then, movies never say die. I just couldn't do it, guys. I couldn't close out this video without talking about The Godfather Part 2. I had a complete brain fart and forgot all about this movie somehow until I was almost done editing this video, and I felt it was a must to come back and add it to the list. The Godfather Part 2 is both a prequel and a sequel, and it's arguably the best sequel of all time. I know just earlier I said The Empire Strikes Back was, but as I said, my old age is creeping up on me, and this one almost slipped through the cracks. But as a film and a sequel, I would have to place The Godfather 2 as the superior film. This movie tells two stories, all within one overarching narrative, and it's as riveting as 3.5 hours of cinema can actually be. I think the performances from Pacino and De Niro, and really everybody, is flawless, as is the writing, the scoring, the direction, the production design. I think the balance of character arcs is seamless with pristine filmmaking at every level. I think The Godfather 2 is a world-class pre-sequel and the pinnacle of mafia movies.
This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Survive a war, you gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?